The violent crack of gunfire shattered the morning calm, sending Elizabeth Anne Jensen's heart racing as she bolted upright in her bed, tangled blonde hair falling around her shoulders. Montana Territory, 1876. Yankton wasn't supposed to be this wild anymore, yet there it was again, the sound of death echoing through the early autumn air. She'd only been in town for 3 days, and already she was questioning her decision to answer the advertisement for a schoolteacher position in this frontier settlement. Elizabeth hurried to her window, peering through thin curtains to see a crowd gathering in the street below. Through the dust and commotion, she spotted Sheriff Miller shaking his head over a motionless form while a tall man in a worn leather duster stood nearby, revolver still smoking in his hand. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but even from her second-floor room, she could see the hard set of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. "Self-defense, plain as day," the sheriff announced loud enough for the onlookers to hear. The fool drew first. The crowd began to disperse, but the tall stranger remained still for a moment longer before holstering his weapon. When he finally turned, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of eyes as blue as the Montana sky, set in a face weathered by sun and hardship. Their gazes locked for a brief, electric moment before she stepped back from the window, heart hammering in her chest. Little did she know that this man, Daniel Robert Lawson, known throughout the territory simply as Renegade, would soon become far more than just a dangerous stranger glimpsed from her window. By afternoon, Elizabeth had nearly convinced herself to return to Boston. She'd come west for adventure and to escape the suffocating expectations of her family, but Yankton seemed more perilous than promising. As the new schoolteacher, she'd been given temporary lodging at Mrs. Wilcott's boarding house until the school's attached living quarters could be properly prepared. Now she sat at her small writing desk, penning a letter to her sister explaining her imminent return. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Jensen?" Mrs. Wilcott's voice called. "Mayor Thompson wishes to see you downstairs." Elizabeth sighed, set down her pen, and smoothed her simple blue dress before making her way downstairs. In the parlor, she found not only the portly Mayor Thompson but also the tall stranger from that morning's shooting. Up close, he was even more imposing, broad-shouldered with a lean, hard frame that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and those remarkable blue eyes studied her with quiet intensity. "Miss Jensen," the mayor said cheerfully, oblivious to her discomfort, "may I present Mr. Daniel Lawson, one of our most respected cattle ranchers. He's offered to escort you to the school tomorrow and help with any repairs needed before classes begin." Daniel Lawson removed his hat and nodded politely. "Madam." His voice was unexpectedly gentle, a deep baritone that seemed at odds with the lethal efficiency she'd witnessed earlier. "Mr. Lawson," she acknowledged stiffly. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite capable of finding my way to the schoolhouse myself." The mayor chuckled. "Miss Jensen, it's not about finding your way. The building's been vacant through the summer, and there may be repairs needed. Dan here is the best carpenter in the county, besides running the Double L Ranch." Elizabeth looked from the mayor to Daniel Lawson, whose expression remained unreadable except for the slightest quirk at the corner of his mouth. "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Call me Daniel," he replied. "I'll be here at 8 tomorrow morning." As they departed, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder how a man who had taken a life so calmly just hours earlier could be described as respected and trusted to escort the town's new schoolteacher. The following morning, Daniel arrived precisely at 8, riding a magnificent chestnut stallion and leading a gentle-looking mare. Elizabeth descended the steps of the boarding house in her riding skirt, carrying a small satchel of supplies. "Good morning, Miss Jensen," he said, tipping his hat. "I thought we might ride rather than take the wagon. The school's about 3 miles west of town." "I don't ride, Mr. Lawson," she replied, eyeing the mare warily. "It's not difficult. Daisy here is gentle as a lamb. Perhaps for someone accustomed to horses," she countered. Daniel studied her for a moment, then dismounted with fluid grace. "Very well. We'll walk. That's not necessary. I'm sure you have more important matters, nothing more important today than getting the schoolhouse ready, he interrupted, tying both horses to the hitching post. The children of Yankton have been waiting for a proper education. Most folks around here can barely write their names. The sincerity in his voice surprised her, and Elizabeth found herself reassessing her initial judgment as they began walking westward out of town. "May I inquire about what happened yesterday morning?" she asked after they'd walked in silence for several minutes. Daniel's stride faltered briefly. "You saw that?" "From my window. It was alarming." He was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "That man was Wade Thornton. He's been rustling cattle from ranches throughout the territory for months. When I recognized him in town, I confronted him. He drew on me." Daniel paused. "I don't take pleasure in violence, Miss Jensen, but out here, sometimes there's little choice." "And the law?" The sheriff seemed remarkably unconcerned. "Sheriff Miller is a good man, but his jurisdiction covers hundreds of miles. Justice works differently in the territories." They continued walking, and gradually, their conversation shifted to more pleasant topics. Daniel asked about Boston, and Elizabeth found herself describing the bustling city streets, the libraries and theaters. In turn, he spoke of Montana, the vastness of the land, the brutal winters, and the breathtaking beauty of spring when the prairies bloomed with wildflowers. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with attached living quarters, Elizabeth realized she'd spent the entire walk engrossed in conversation with a man she'd initially feared. The schoolhouse needed substantial work. A family of raccoons had taken up residence during the summer, the roof leaked in 3 places, and half the window panes were cracked or missing entirely. "Well," Elizabeth sighed, surveying the damage, "I suppose I'll need to inform Mayor Thompson that classes will have to be delayed." Daniel rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscled forearms tanned by the sun. "Not necessarily. If you're willing to help, we can have this place habitable by sundown." For the next several hours, they worked side by side. Daniel repaired the roof and windows while Elizabeth swept, scrubbed, and organized the interior. By late afternoon, sweat dampened her collar, and dust streaked her face, but the schoolhouse was beginning to resemble a place of learning. As the sun began to set, they sat on the schoolhouse steps, sharing a canteen of water and the sandwiches Mrs. Wilcott had packed for them. "Thank you," Elizabeth said sincerely. "You didn't have to spend your entire day helping me. I meant what I said about education being important." Daniel gazed out at the rolling landscape. "I never had much schooling myself. Learned to read from my mother, but she passed when I was 12. Been on my own since then. Yet you speak as if you're well read?" He smiled slightly. "Books are good company on winter nights." "My ranch house has quite a collection. Any book that finds its way to Yankton eventually ends up on my shelves. I'd like to see that someday," Elizabeth said, then blushed at her forwardness. Daniel glanced at her, something warm flickering in his eyes. "You'd be welcome any time, Miss Jensen." "Elizabeth," she corrected, surprising herself. "If I'm to call you Daniel, then you should call me Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," he repeated, and the way he said her name made her heartbeat quicken. The walk back to town was pleasant in the cool evening air, and when they reached Mrs. Wilcott's boarding house, Elizabeth found herself reluctant to part ways. "I'll bring a wagon tomorrow," Daniel said, "for your belongings. And perhaps we could find time for a riding lesson, if you're amenable." "I'd like that," she replied, meaning it. As the days passed, Elizabeth settled into life in Yankton. Classes began with 17 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. To her surprise, Daniel often appeared at the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons, sometimes with a repaired desk or new books, other times simply to escort her back to town. These walks became the highlight of Elizabeth's week, their conversations ranging from literature to philosophy to the practical matters of frontier life. Sometimes they fell into comfortable silence, and Elizabeth found herself studying Daniel's profile, wondering about the experiences that had shaped him into the complex man beside her, capable of both lethal violence and profound gentleness. October brought the first frost, painting the landscape in crystalline white each morning before the sun melted it away. On one such morning, Daniel arrived at the schoolhouse with 2 horses. "Time for that riding lesson," he announced. "If you're still interested." Elizabeth eyed the mare nervously. "I suppose there's no avoiding it if I'm to live out here." Daniel's lessons were patient and thorough. He taught her how to approach the horse, how to saddle and mount, how to use the reins and her legs to communicate. By the end of the afternoon, Elizabeth was riding in slow circles around the schoolyard, laughing with a sense of accomplishment. "You're a natural," Daniel called, watching her with evident pride. "Hardly," she replied, carefully guiding the mare back to where he stood. "But I'm grateful for the lesson." As she attempted to dismount, her foot caught in the stirrup, and she tumbled forward with a startled cry. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and suddenly she found herself pressed against Daniel's chest, his hands steadying her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Elizabeth looked up into his face, so close she could see flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "Yes," she whispered, acutely aware of his hands on her waist, the warmth of his body. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might kiss her. Then he gently set her on her feet and stepped back. "You did well today," he said, turning to adjust the mare's saddle. "Next time will be easier." That night, Elizabeth lay awake in her bed at the teacher's quarters, replaying the moment in her mind. The feel of his arms around her, the look in his eyes, these were dangerous thoughts for a schoolteacher to entertain about a man like Daniel Lawson. Yet she couldn't deny the growing attraction between them, or the way her heart raced whenever he appeared at the schoolhouse door. November brought an early snowstorm that trapped Elizabeth and her students in the schoolhouse overnight. Parents arrived the next morning to collect their children, and last among them was Daniel, bringing supplies and checking that she was safe. "I was worried," he admitted as they stood by the wood stove, warming their hands. The last student had just departed with her father, leaving them alone. "We were fine," Elizabeth assured him. "Though I must confess I was grateful for all your insistence on stocking extra firewood." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Winter comes hard and fast in Montana. You should stay in town until spring." "And abandon my students for months?" "I couldn't." "Then at least let me check on you regularly. The trail between town and the schoolhouse can disappear completely in a heavy snow." Elizabeth found herself touched by his concern. "I would welcome your visits," she said softly. Their eyes met, and this time when Daniel moved toward her, there was purpose in his step. His hand came up to cup her cheek, callous fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Elizabeth," he murmured, "I should leave before I do something improper." "And if I don't want you to leave?" The boldness of her words surprised her, but she didn't regret them. His kiss was tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. Elizabeth felt herself responding with an intensity that would have scandalized her Boston acquaintances, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her palms. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "I've wanted to do that since the day we met," Daniel confessed, resting his forehead against hers. "Even when I was being difficult about riding lessons?" He chuckled. "Especially then. Your stubbornness reminded me that you're not some delicate flower that needs constant protection. You're stronger than you realize, Elizabeth Jensen." The winter deepened, bringing fierce storms and temperatures that froze the creek solid. True to his word, Daniel visited regularly, sometimes staying to help with lessons, teaching the older boys practical mathematics through examples of ranch management or carpentry. The students adored him, and Elizabeth found herself falling deeper under his spell, charmed by his patience with the children and his evident respect for her work. Their courtship progressed slowly, constrained by propriety and the harsh weather that often made travel between the ranch and schoolhouse impossible. On the occasions when Daniel could stay for dinner, they would sit before the fire afterward, talking for hours or reading aloud from Elizabeth's growing collection of books. It was during one such evening in January when Daniel first spoke of his past. "I killed my first man when I was 18, he said quietly, staring into the flames. "He was rustling cattle from my employer. I tracked him for 2 days before confronting him." Elizabeth remained silent, sensing he needed to continue. "He drew on me, just like Wade Thornton did in town that day. I was faster." Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "It changes you, taking a life? Makes something inside go hard and cold. Is that why they call you Renegade?" Elizabeth asked softly. She'd heard the nickname whispered in town but had never used it herself. Daniel nodded. "I built a reputation as someone who wouldn't be cheated or threatened. It helped me establish the ranch, but sometimes I wonder about the cost." Elizabeth moved to sit beside him, taking one of his hands in hers. "The man I know is kind and honorable. Whatever you had to do to survive, it didn't destroy the good in you, Daniel." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You make me want to be worthy of your good opinion." As winter gave way to spring, their feelings deepened. Daniel began making improvements to his ranch house, adding bookshelves, ordering a new piano from Denver, renovating the kitchen. Elizabeth understood these changes for what they were, preparations for a future he hoped they might share. The proposal came on a mild April evening as they rode alongside the now rushing creek that bordered Daniel's property. Elizabeth had become a confident rider over the months, though she still preferred the gentle mare to Daniel's more spirited stallion. They dismounted near a grove of cottonwoods, and Daniel spread a blanket for them to sit upon while they ate the picnic dinner he packed. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, he took her hand. "Elizabeth, I've been alone most of my life. Built walls around myself that I thought would never come down." His voice was husky with emotion. "Then you arrived in Yankton with your books and your Eastern ways, challenging everything I thought I knew." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I love you, Elizabeth Jensen. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring inside was a simple gold band with a modest diamond, but to Elizabeth, it was perfect. "Yes," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Yes, I'll marry you, Daniel Lawson." Their kiss was tender and full of promise, but as they pulled apart, a distant rumble caught their attention. Daniel's expression shifted from joy to concern as he looked toward the creek. "Spring melt," he muttered, rising quickly. "The mountains had heavy snow this year." Elizabeth stood beside him, following his gaze to where the creek had visibly risen in the short time they'd been sitting. The water churned angrily, carrying debris from farther upstream. "We should head back," Daniel said urgently, gathering the blanket and picnic basket. "The lower crossing might already be flooded." They mounted quickly and rode toward the creek crossing, but by the time they arrived, the normally placid ford had become a roaring torrent, the water rising by the minute as snow melt from the distant mountains surged downstream. "We'll have to try the upper crossing," Daniel called over the roar of the water. "It's narrower there, with higher banks." They rode hard along the creek bank, the horses sensing their riders' urgency. When they reached the upper crossing, they found a fallen tree had created a natural, if precarious, bridge across the swollen water. "I'll go first," Daniel said, dismounting. "Then lead the horses across one at a time." Elizabeth watched anxiously as he carefully made his way across the slippery trunk, exhaling with relief when he reached the other side. He secured his stallion, then beckoned for her to hand over Daisy's reins. The mare was reluctant, sensing danger, but eventually allowed Daniel to guide her across. Now it was Elizabeth's turn, and she eyed the makeshift bridge with trepidation. "You can do this," Daniel encouraged from the opposite bank. "Just take it slow and steady." Elizabeth nodded, gathering her courage. She placed one foot on the trunk, then the other, arms extended for balance. The wood was slick with spray from the rushing water below, and halfway across, her boots slipped. She recovered her balance, heart pounding, but the momentary panic had shaken her confidence. She looked down at the churning water, a mistake. Vertigo swept through her, and she froze, unable to move forward or back. "Daniel!" she called, voice tight with fear. "I can't, look at me, not at the water," he commanded, his tone steady. "Keep your eyes on me and take one step at a time." Elizabeth forced herself to look up, focusing on Daniel's face rather than the dangerous current below. She took another tentative step, then another. "That's it," he encouraged. "You're almost here." But at that moment, a large branch carried downstream slammed into the fallen tree, jarring it violently. Elizabeth lost her footing and plunged into the icy water with a terrified scream. The current immediately seized her, tumbling her beneath the surface. She fought desperately to reach air, lungs burning. When she broke the surface, gasping, she saw Daniel running along the bank, keeping pace with the current that carried her downstream. "Grab for branches!" he shouted. "Try to get to the edge." Elizabeth flailed, reaching for anything that might stop her wild journey. Her fingers scraped against a protruding rock, but the current tore her away before she could grasp it. The creek was widening, the water deeper and more powerful. Ahead, she could see Daniel mounting his horse and urging it into a gallop, racing to get ahead of her. He reached a bend in the creek and plunged into the water without hesitation, positioning himself in her path. As the current swept her toward him, she saw the determination in his face. Elizabeth stretched out her arms, and then she was crashing into him, his strong arms wrapping around her as the water tried to tear them apart. "Hold on to me," he ordered, fighting against the powerful current. "The water's too deep," she gasped, terrified that they would both drown. Daniel tightened his grip. "Then I'll be the ground beneath you," he promised, his voice fierce with resolve. With incredible effort he maneuvered them toward the bank, his boots occasionally finding purchase on the creek bed. When they finally reached shallow water, Daniel half carried, half dragged Elizabeth onto the muddy bank, both of them collapsing in exhaustion. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pushing wet hair from her face with trembling hands. Elizabeth shook her head, too overwhelmed to speak. Daniel pulled her against his chest, his body shaking with what she realized were suppressed sobs. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "God, Elizabeth, when you went into that water." She clung to him, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her cheek. "You came for me. You saved me. Always," he vowed. "I will always come for you, Elizabeth Jensen. As long as I live." They married in May, with the entire town of Yankton in attendance. Elizabeth wore a gown ordered from Denver, and Daniel surprised her by appearing in a proper suit rather than his usual ranch attire. Mayor Thompson officiated, and Mrs. Wilcott wept openly throughout the ceremony. Elizabeth continued teaching until the end of the school term, then moved permanently to the Double L Ranch. Their home became known throughout the territory for its extensive library and the scholarship fund they established for promising students who wished to pursue higher education. 2 years after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a son they named William Thomas Lawson. A daughter, Margaret Rose, followed 2 years later. Both children inherited their father's blue eyes and their mother's love of books. Daniel never again had to draw his gun in violence. The name, Renegade, faded into legend, replaced by school board president, and later state representative, when Montana achieved statehood. He became known as a fair and progressive voice in territorial politics, advocating for education and responsible development. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Elizabeth with a journey east to visit her family in Boston. The Jensens, who had initially disapproved of her wild frontiersman, were forced to admit that Daniel was a gentleman in all the ways that truly mattered. "Did you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard. "Pulling me from that creek? Our life together?" Daniel's laugh was warm and genuine. Regret saving the woman I love? Never. He took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there a decade earlier. Though I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if you'd been a better tree climber. Elizabeth swatted his arm playfully. And I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been so stubborn about teaching me to ride. We were destined to find each other, Daniel said with uncharacteristic sentiment. If not by the creek, then somewhere else. Some stories are written in the stars, Elizabeth. As the sun set over the Montana landscape they both had come to love, Elizabeth rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that the ground beneath her would never give way, not while Daniel Lawson stood beside her. In 1912, when Elizabeth published her memoirs of frontier life, she dedicated the book to Daniel, who taught me that love, like water, finds its way through any obstacle and who has been my solid ground through all of life's currents. The book became a modest success, cherished by a generation who watched the wild frontier transform into settled communities. When Daniel passed away in 1919, the entire town of Yankton, now a thriving city, attended his funeral. Elizabeth lived another 7 years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and the books they had collected together over a lifetime of love and learning in the West that had once seemed so foreign to a Boston schoolteacher. Their story was told and retold throughout Montana, a testament to courage, commitment, and the unexpected ways love could transform even the wildest hearts.